Hello, everyone, and welcome to Woobergs, the Magic the Gathering content equivalent of trying to find your lover a nice toy. That sounds sexual. I meant like a bocce ball? Is that a toy? Anyways, I am your host, Johnny Bartlett, also known as Gafawker amongst the internet folks. You can find me on Discord, Reddit, Twitch, etc. And this series in particular is going to be all about the competitive and casual communities of EDH. I've noticed there's been a lot of distaste and discrepancies between the two communities lately about how we should be enjoying the format, who's playing it correctly, pub stomping, the ban list, whether or not we should be two separate formats, all that jazz. And I wanted to make a series that was sort of focused on bridging the divide in the community and talking about both sides from a hopefully unbiased, I mean, let's be real, we all have biases, but as unbiased as I can be, viewpoint of why we're playing the game the way we're playing, and in the end that we're all just playing the same format because it's an incredible format that we all enjoy. So that's the point of this series, and this episode in particular, we're going to be talking about the philosophy and play patterns and styles of CEDH versus EDH. So to get into the nitty-gritty of why we might be playing the same format in different ways, what we're hoping to accomplish as players by playing in these different ways, and how we can better communicate our wants out of the game. Next week, I'll be doing an episode on some of the terminology of more competitive players and tables so that we can better recognize our power level, so to speak, and what we want out of the game and how to identify each other's decks and goals. But we'll get into that next week. So let's start this episode off by talking about the philosophy and the community's ideas on what competitive is versus casual. And I want to preface this by saying all of this is based on my own opinions, my own ideas, the things I've formulated over time, playing with both sides of the communities. I play both at competitive and casual tables. So based on that, and this does not mean my opinion is right by any means. Your experiences have created your own opinion and thoughts of this discussion, and I would love to hear what you have to say about it in the comments. This is mostly a jumping off point to get the dialogue started as to what casual players are looking for versus what competitive players are looking for. So, from what I have found, the community's ideas are, and this is a broad generalization based on the people I've talked to, the community's ideas are that casual players are focused on making the game fun first and foremost. That fun is the most important thing in a game of Magic, and that everyone at the table should be having fun throughout. And the community's ideas on competitive are that players are in it to win, and winning the game is the most important thing, and it doesn't matter if you have to sacrifice other players' fun in order to win the game. So I want to start by breaking down these ideas. The casual perspective that the game is focused on fun first and foremost. I think this idea falls apart almost immediately because the idea of fun is entirely subjective. There's no blanket definition we can use to define whether or not a player is having fun. It's based on our own experiences. A player may have fun building a giant stacks machine that disables all of their opponents from being able to play the game, and another player may have fun by running ladies looking to the left tribal. There's no blanket line of what fun is, and so we can't gauge our experiences off of a non-universal idea. So I'll do another video on this later on why I think we should be playing to win and not playing for fun, but that's a different topic. So I think the sentiment of this idea is great. What I believe it's trying to express is that casual players are using Magic the Gathering as a tool to engage and spend time with their friends. That's what they mean by it's fun. It's something that we can do together, and therefore we should all enjoy it. It means the win doesn't matter because we get to sit around the table, bullshit and chat and catch up on the last couple of weeks. We haven't seen each other for a while, and this is our way of getting everyone in a room together. I think it's a beautiful sentiment. I just think the way it's phrased is phrased poorly. Now, from the competitive side of things, that this idea that winning is the goal, that from the competitive side of things, this idea that the win is the most important thing in the game, I also think this is a very flawed idea about what competitive players are trying to do. Yes, winning is the goal of a game of Magic, and so everyone plays to that goal, but competitive players are still playing to have fun in the same sense that a casual player is. They're still using it as an excuse to get together with their friends, to bullshit, to chat, to catch up with each other and talk about life, you know. It's not about the win still. I think this is where the biggest divide between the two communities come. And the best way I can think to express it is that players who are playing competitively they want to play a game of Magic the Gathering, while players who are playing casually want something to do with their friends. It's the idea that a competitive table is focused on the game first while having fun with friends, and a casual table is focused on having fun with friends while using the game to do so. It's like going putt-putt golfing with your friends. You know, there are some groups of friends who are very competitive and they'll keep track and everyone's shooting for holes in one. At the end of the day, someone wins the game and everyone else loses. But they're still bullshitting and chatting and having fun along the way. While a more casual group of putt-putt golfers are just looking for something to do on a Friday night. And so they go, the putt-putt ring is open. Let's go hit some balls. And they don't keep track of score or anything. They just go and they hit the ball around and they have fun. And I know it's a very, very small difference and it's hard to break down. So if this is confusing, leave a comment and let me know and I'll try to break it down further. But I think what it comes down to ultimately is that competitive players they enjoy the game of Magic the Gathering, and so they want to get everyone together to do something they all enjoy. While more casual players enjoy the game of Magic the Gathering, but they aren't necessarily enjoying the game, so to speak, but the social encounters that the game provides. It allows us to meet new people, connect with our friends, all those little things like that. And I think by presenting it as this idea of casual players are playing for fun while competitive players are playing to win presents both sides of the community in a very negative light. And I think we should look at the way we talk about why we're playing. Because players playing for fun only makes it seem like they don't care about the rules or the interaction or the game itself. They could be doing anything, and they just so happen to be playing Magic the Gathering. While playing to win makes it seem like the players don't care about socializing or each other's play experiences or how much fun we're having. I think we should look at it more that casual players are focused on socialization, using Magic as a tool for that socialization, while competitive players are focused on playing a game of Magic and socializing while doing so. It's a very distinct difference, but it's the best I've come up with from my engagement in both sides of the community. And so this brings us to the play patterns and styles you might see at a CEDH table versus an EDH table. And by that, I mean what you can expect to see when you sit down at a more casual table versus a more competitive table. Things like how the game will be played. I like air quotes. Don't judge me. Expectations of other players and yourself, and how these philosophies influence the play styles that you'll see at different tables. So, from my experience, I think there are 3 different ways to talk about decks and play styles. We have casual, optimized, and competitive. I think these 3 terms are used pretty colloquially through the community, and they help us sort of talk about our deck's power level, but we have a very loose definition of what they all are, And so I think we need to better define them so that we know what they are and where we fit in this scale. And I want to reiterate that all of this is based on my own experiences. Your experiences may have led you to believe different things or feel different ways about the game and the different sides of the community. But as I said, this is a jumping off point so that we can all start the discussion. So, from what I have seen, a casual table is under the expectation that we react and respond to what is currently presented on the board, and that all of our information and decisions are derived from the board state. And by that I mean, we're not looking at the entire history of Magic. We're not expected to know everything that could be a possibility. The agreement is what I see on the table is what I have to react to. So if you play a threat, a big stompy creature, it's okay for me to respond to that because you presented the creature for me to respond to. But if you play a combo, there's no way I could have predicted that that's something you would do based on my experiences and knowledge. So it feels unfair and like a sort of gotcha moment, you know? If you're stepping outside of this board state idea, it suddenly becomes an intellectual battle that wasn't expected. Players are suddenly expected to have a vast knowledge of the history of cards, what's been printed, what are common answers, what are common strategies, things that casual players just don't know because it's a lot. There's over 20,000 cards printed and like hundreds of mechanics, and every card interacts with each other in weird and unusual ways that sometimes aren't predictable. And so the arrangement of casual players is to say, let's not have to think about all this. Let's not have to spend hours studying and learning this game, and let's just play a game of Magic in which we react to what we can see. Playing a game of casual Magic is like playing a game of chess. You know how all the pieces operate, you know how they move, and so all you have to do is move your pieces based on how your opponent moves. And I believe this is why things like counterspells, stacks, combo decks, these aren't as accepted in a casual table because they're changing the expectation. You're forcing a player to understand more about the game than they probably have the time or energy or willingness to do so. And that's totally fine. Playing casually is totally cool. I'm all for it. I think there's way too much in this game to try to keep up with at all times unless you're like fully invested into it. And most of us have jobs and school and families and other hobbies that we're invested into. So Magic we aren't as deep into the culture of it as other people. And I think that's where you find casual players. So now let's talk about competitive, because optimized is a whole nother beast that we'll get into in a second. And competitive is a lot easier to talk about, I think. So I think the expectation at a competitive table is that all players have a depth of knowledge of the game, the mechanics, the rules, and the history. Therefore, anything is allowed because players are expecting and can respond to it. If you go into the game knowing anything is possible, then it becomes a lot easier for you to react to the anything. And I think that's where competitive players lie. It's not about the board state anymore. It's about knowing Magic as a whole. It's what can I expect to see here? What could my opponent be presenting beyond just what's on the board? It's what are common strategies in the meta? What are common cards that are used? You have to know more about the culture and history of Magic than at a casual table because you have to be ready for anything. And that's why things like counterspells and interaction and playing at instant speed are so big in a competitive table, because you're moving the game off the board and into your heads and hands. It becomes a game of bluffing and deceit and trickery and how can I present information to my opponents that I may not have because I know they're expecting this stuff? And what might my opponents be able to do? What might they be presenting based on what their deck is, the mana, the cards I've seen them play, etc. It opens up the game significantly because, as I said, there's like 20,000 plus cards in Magic the Gathering, hundreds of interactions, and you as a player have to be responsible for assuming what your opponent can be doing. And I think this is the biggest difference between casual and competitive tables, is that casual tables don't force players to have that knowledge. They don't expect you to be able to figure out all of Magic in its entirety sitting at a table looking at 2 open blue mana. They say, our agreement is that I'm going to present you with information and you're going to present me with information, and that's how we play the game. While at a competitive table, it's more like, I'm going to give you as little as possible, and you're going to give me as little as possible, and we have to try to figure it out and piece it together. And I think that's why we see the biggest discrepancies in power level, which I'll get into in another video. But let's talk about Optimized now, because Optimized is a whole different beast. It's a lot harder to define. I think Optimized decks lie basically on one of 2 areas. Either decks that aren't quite competitive but are trying to be, or decks that are trying to push the limits of casual as far as they can go. I think the best way I've come to define an optimized deck is the expectation seems to be that all players have a knowledge of what is possible and efficient in casual and how to answer and to build to the top ends of these decks while still obliging to the social contract. Now, the social contract is something I want to spend a whole video talking on, but to briefly talk about the social contract right now, it's essentially the agreed upon usage of cards at a table. And it's mostly defined by a casual table because casual tables are the ones that aren't expecting or planning for everything. And so we create a social contract, so to speak, that says these are things you could be doing, but because we can't prepare for everything, we should try to stray away from them. Things like mass land destruction, stacks, a ton of extra turns cards. These are things that they almost need to be responded to, otherwise they change the flow of the game dramatically. And so the social contract dictates, because we aren't playing at a level where responses and stuff are commonly accepted, especially not instant speed responses, then we have to think really hard about our inclusion of these cards. And I think Optimize still takes that social contract into consideration when building. These decks are the ones that are the most misunderstood and hated amongst the community, because if you have a very tuned optimized deck, it is leagues better than a casual deck because it forces interaction. It requires players to respond to certain things. Otherwise, the player playing the optimized deck will just win the game. Things like Cyclonic Rift, things like Expropriate, these are cards you find in an optimized and tuned deck because they are running very good cards with the expectation that they're not going to get interacted with in a casual table. And so when they don't get interacted with, they dramatically change the swing of the game. But these are decks that aren't fully invested into competitive. Their mana bases may be off. They may not have invested in $300 fast mana, things like that. And so they don't quite keep up with a competitive table. So someone playing an optimized deck with mostly casual players will probably think their deck is competitive because of how dramatically different the gameplay is, because of how often they're winning and how disgruntled their group may be about the deck. But someone playing with an optimized deck against competitive decks may not feel the same way. They may feel like they're being hated out of the game and that their deck isn't playing the degenerate things that a competitive deck is. You know, an optimized deck feels more fair if you're going against decks with interaction, but it feels less fair if you're going against decks that are built to fast combo out and stuff. It's a really tricky line. And that's why I think optimized decks are so hated in the community, because they present themselves as competitive, but they aren't strong enough to play competitively. They often have a mixture of playing with information presented on the board state. That's often how they win the game, is through combat or a Craterhoof Behemoth or Ulamogs or some sort of big stompy creature. But they still force interaction and require players to play off of the board. You have to have counterspells. You have to have edicts. You have to have cards that force. You have to have cards that are able to respond to what the player is doing immediately, rather than just being able to respond to what they've done. That's why I think Optimized is really hard to place, because it's almost in its own category. It doesn't quite fit at a table with casual decks, and it doesn't quite fit at a table with competitive decks. Now, obviously, they can be tweaked to be at the top end of an optimized deck, which might hang a little better with competitive decks, or at the bottom end, which might hang a little better with casual decks. But I think the important thing to remember is that we shouldn't be defining the decks based on their power level, so to speak, but in the way that we're presenting the information to our opponents and how we expect them to respond. So casual decks are players that are building decks with the expectation that players are playing to the presented information on the board. So it's a lot of permanence, a lot of sorcery speed interaction, things that destroy and interact with permanence, things along those lines. Optimized decks are players that are building decks and coming with the expectation that they can do anything within the social contract, which means counterspells and stuff are now allowed. You're moving the game off the board and into the hands. You're presenting less information and trying to have your opponents figure out what you're going to do. And competitive decks are players that are building decks and coming with the expectation that anything is allowed because other players are prepared for it. And that's the important part in a competitive deck, is that you only play competitive with other competitive players, because they're expecting it. If you bring a competitive deck to a casual table, it creates a lot of feel bad moments, because now every play is a gotcha play, you know? You're making your opponent feel inferior because you're tricking them constantly. You're saying, I don't care that you weren't expecting this, I'm going to do it anyways. And I think those are some of our biggest discrepancies in the format. And I think these play styles are a better way to dictate what level our decks are on. If we talk about our decks in terms of how we present our information and what we're expecting of the other players, it's a lot easier to identify how strong our decks are and what we're planning to do with them. So to summarize, casual players are playing a game of Magic as a form of socialization. And that means there's not an expectation of understanding the intricate interactions, the history, every single card that's ever been printed, and knowing the micro information presented in a game. It's a lot like playing a game of chess. You know how every piece moves, you know exactly what's going to happen, and so all you have to do is respond to how your opponents are playing. Now, competitive players are playing a game of Magic while socializing in doing so. They are players who are heavily invested in the history and culture and interactions of Magic, and part of the fun of playing is to flaunt that knowledge in a sense. Their games consist of intricate decisions, understanding the history, knowing how to interpret information that doesn't exist based on everything that's happened in the game in the past and everything that could possibly happen in the future. So it's a lot more like playing a game of poker. You don't know all of the information your opponent has, and so you're trying to bluff and trick each other into winning the game, so to speak. And optimized players they're somewhere in the middle, which is a cop-out, but the best way to identify them, I don't think their philosophy falls in either the competitive or the casual philosophy, because I think they are casual players learning to play competitively. They're on that bridge, you know? And that may be where they want to lie because of the barrier of entry into competitive, because competitive feels too structured or too linear, or they like the open-endedness of a more optimized deck rather than a casual deck. There's many reasons why a player might stay optimized rather than playing competitively or casual. But optimized players are players that are building decks, and optimized players are players that are confining to the social contract at the peak of its ability. Next week, we'll do an episode on terminology, talk about some of the words, phrases, and expressions that you might see more competitive players use, and that might help you identify where a player lies in casual versus optimized versus competitive. And hopefully that helps. Hopefully this episode helps, talking about the philosophy and breaking down why these formats are played the way they are. If you have differing opinions, once again, I invite you to talk about it in the comments. I will pop in and we can chat and figure out what the formats mean to you and why you play casually or competitively or optimized. And hopefully we can just better understand each other in this incredible format, in this game that we love playing. Until next time, I have been your host, Johnny Bartlett. Please feel free to like or subscribe or follow or all that jazz that people do to show their support. I appreciate it significantly, and it's what allows me to make dumb videos like this and talk about things like this. Follow me on Twitch. I'm going to be streaming every Monday night. Hopefully that schedule may change, but I will let everyone know if it does. Until next time, stay fresh. Do people still use fresh?